Back in 2003, an anime adaptation of a light novel written by Keiichi Sigsawa called Kino no Tabi, The Beautiful World, or just Kino's Journey in English, would start airing. An episodic anime that takes us on a journey with the titular character Kino and her motorrad Hermes through a bunch of different countries, where we get to experience their culture and everyday life for 3 days before we move on to the next country. In 2017, this show would get a remake in the form of Kino's Journey, The Beautiful World, the animated series. Yes, I know, Japan is really good at titles. This remake would take a bit of a different approach to how it would adapt the stories of Kino's Journey. But was it for the better? Join me as we take a closer look at these two versions of Kinos and try to figure out which of them works best. The original Kino's Journey anime is a 13-episode series produced by Studio ACGT and directed by Ryutaro Nakamura, who's also directed series like Serial Experiments Lain and Ghost Hound. The show follows Kino and her motorrad Hermes on their journey to different countries, where they get to experience the differences and similarities in the culture and people they come across, and maybe even learn a little more about themselves and this beautiful world. Like I said earlier, Kinos is an episodic show. More or less every episode starts with Kino going to a different country and spending 3 days there to observe the people, before she leaves and heads off for a different country. There are some episodes that deviate from that, but for the most part, it sticks to this formula. Every country Kino visits is unique in some way, whether it be something like the way the country is run, the people's views on adulthood, or even countries where your morals are being put into question. And how it goes about exploring this is quite neat. For you see, while our main character is Kino, she's not really ever the focal point of the stories. She's just our eyes nearest in a foreign land. Kino is basically a self-insert character. She doesn't display a whole lot of her personality, and even her design is very androgynous, to the point where even the characters in the show aren't always sure if she's a boy or a girl. That's not to say she has zero personality. Some of it usually comes out in the banter between herself and Hermes, but for the most part, she likes to stay fairly neutral. Now I know some people might not think that sounds like a great main character for a story, but in the context of this show, Kino is the best character you can use. Her role is not to get too involved with what everyone else is doing, she is just there to observe. The story doesn't really revolve around her. She is just a tool for which to move the story around, and I think the show uses Kino very well in this regard. But just like I said before, that doesn't mean that it always sticks to this formula, because Kino is also quite skilled with a gun, so she is capable of defending herself should a need for it arise. And in the only 2-episode story in this show, she even breaks her usual stride completely and decides to take action. Kino even has her own backstory that we get to see in episode 4, meaning that her choice to always stay neutral and just observe is just that, a choice, rather than a lack of character. Another thing that I have to touch on is the art in this show. As you can see, the character designs are very minimalistic, and the colors and backgrounds are very washed out and grayish a lot of the time. This helps with that monotone and almost negative feeling the show can have at times, which is in my opinion a nice contrast to the subtitle, since it's called The Beautiful World, because the world can often seem grey and evil, but it is also quite beautiful. Now, the remake of Kino's Journey on the other hand is a 12-episode series produced by Studio Lurch and directed by Tomohisa Taguchi, who's also directed shows like Persona 4 The Golden Animation and Twin Star Exorcists. So not exactly the best track record. This version of Kinos decided to adapt the light novel in a slightly different way than the original. For rather than just redoing the same stories the original had already done, or create a sequel to a show that is 14 years old, the producers of this show opted for an adaptation that would give the fans of Kino exactly what they wanted. So they asked the fans of the light novel exactly what stories they would like to see adapted in this modern version, and they would pick the 12 most popular stories. Now, that sounds like a pretty good idea, doesn't it? Give the fans exactly what they want. It sure isn't a bad way to go about adapting a show, and especially not something like Kino that is very episodic and doesn't really have much of an overarching plot to worry about. For me, there is just one problem with this way of doing things, and that's the problem of what this might do to the framing and themes of Kino. For you see, when you ask the fans what they want to see adapted, they obviously want to see the stories that they themselves had the most fun reading get adapted. And while there isn't anything wrong with that, there is always something that will get lost in translation when going about it in this way. Remember what I said about Kino in the original anime? About how she was more of an observer that would take in and learn about the culture and the people of the different countries she went to visit? And about how every once in a while, the show would change this up in order to not get stale? Yeah, what do you think the most popular stories of Kinos are? They are obviously the stories where Kino takes center stage and takes action. This gives the remake of Kinos a completely different tone, as instead of following a traveler who is experiencing different countries and their culture, we get a character who is always brandishing her gun and at times seem like she is just going around to try to fix every country's problems. That to me kinda ruins the tone of Kino, as that isn't really the point of Kino's journey. At least not to me. It almost paints Kino as more of a superhero at times than just a regular traveler. Sure, not every episode of the remake is like this, but there's still too many episodes in a row like that. It makes this adaptation feel like they cared more about just giving the fans the stories they wanted to see with updated art and animation, rather than give too much thought to the themes and messages of Kinos. And that's very sad to me. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this remake does everything wrong in how to adapt Kinos. The art and animation got an upgrade. Now Kinos is looking way more colorful and beautiful, which kind of ironically is a better fit for this version of the show, since the original has a more grey and negative feel to it, and the remake is more bright and optimistic. The only one not feeling bright and optimistic was the one doing the CG for this show. If you ask me though, I would rather have more minimalistic art and maintain the grey tones of the original, rather than make it look prettier for the sake of looking pretty. Maybe that's more of a reflection on me as a person, but I definitely prefer the original to the remake in that regard. Also, something about Kino in the remake makes her seem more like a problem solver to me, and with the sort of problems that comes up in this show, it feels more like childish optimism to me. My Kino is not a problem solver. She's just there to observe and reflect upon the things she's seen, and in turn force us to reflect upon the things we've seen. That sadly is mostly lost in the remake, even though it also does adapt some of the same stories as the original did. It's just that the way those stories are framed makes them feel very different from the 2003 version. So those are my thoughts on Kino's journey and the remake. I definitely prefer the 2003 version to the 2017 version, and before you say something like, you only like the original because you watched it first, then I'm sorry to have to say that I actually watched the remake first. Then I went back and watched the original. I think the 2017 version is better for fans of the source material, since it's more of a highlight reel of a select few of the stories from the light novel. But for someone who only watched it because they'd been recommended to watch Kinos, it was very disappointing. Kino became an even more bland character, since she is now a badass with guns who can fix anything except for her lack of a personality. Unlike the original, where the lack of a distinct personality feels more like a character trait, and it allows the stories of the people and countries to flow since Kino doesn't always have to take center stage. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, then don't forget to leave a like, and subscribe for more anime related content from the anime top scholar himself. Also, don't forget to leave a comment letting me know which version of Kinos you prefer, or if you've seen any Kino at all. Anyways, I'll see you all on the next video in about 2 weeks' time. Peace.